Hello, and welcome to the Duke Cardiology Conference. I'm Sunil Rao, Associate Professor of Medicine at Duke University Medical Center. Today's program is titled Atrial Fibrillation, Achieving Safer Anticoagulation, and our distinguished guest is Dr. John Alexander, Associate Professor of Medicine at Duke University Medical Center here in Durham, North Carolina. John, thanks for joining us.
Thrilled to be here.
So, it's interesting. We've had so much focus on ischemic heart disease in cardiology, and I think traditionally atrial fibrillation has been looked at as kind of a, I don't want to say nuisance, but something that we sort of think about secondarily. Of course, now there's a tremendous amount of interest in atrial fibrillation as the population ages, and you're going to talk to us today about some new alternatives that we have for the good old warfarin strategy that has really stood the test of time. So what do you have for us?
So that's right. I'm going to talk about anticoagulation, and starting about 5-6 years ago in my clinic, I started promising patients that within a number of years we'd have an alternative to warfarin and they could stop worrying about what their INR is. And now we actually do have one, and I think we'll soon have several good alternatives to warfarin. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So, atrial fibrillation is an irregular heart rhythm. And when I was a fellow, I was told by some of our electrophysiology faculty that it's not an EP problem. It's a general cardiology problem. And it really, in many ways, is a nuisance. But the one part of atrial fibrillation which isn't a nuisance is stroke. Mm-hmm. And we know that patients with atrial fibrillation have a greatly increased risk of stroke, and that those strokes are particularly debilitating. As you alluded to, the age of the U.S. population is going up. And when you get up into the 70, 80-year-old, which we now really consider middle age, the incidence of atrial fibrillation is around 10%. So it's common. It's not really an unusual condition. And so there's really an epidemic of it in the U.S. and globally. As I had mentioned, stroke is the major adverse outcome from atrial fibrillation. There's a lot of actually work right now being done in ablation too, mm-hmm. a different topic. Yeah. But really somewhere around a quarter of strokes are due to atrial fibrillation. They're from thrombi that form in the atria. They embolize, and they cause generally large, devastating strokes. And these strokes are much more driven by comorbidities, like advancing age, than they are by the atrial fibrillation itself. So we have various scoring systems to classify people's risk of stroke, and those are mostly, as I said, due to comorbidities, not the atrial fibrillation itself. Well, when you think about antithrombotic therapy in atrial fibrillation, and you asked me to come here today and talk to you about safer, but you can't talk about safer without talking about efficacy. Yeah. Because no anticoagulation is the most safe, but it has no efficacy. And this is a place where you really do need efficacy, and you want to get that efficacy without compromising safety. And what's been really exciting and somewhat, I would say, unexpected about these new anticoagulants is that they really do appear safer, and I'll talk about that. So let me start, though, with warfarin, because I think people hate warfarin. And they hate it. And patients hate it. Everybody hates it. But it really is one of the most effective drugs we have. I mean, how many cardiology drugs reduce a really important clinical endpoint like stroke by 2/3? I mean, it's a huge treatment effect. There were a series of 6 small, hundreds of patient trials done. And when you have a treatment effect that is that large, you can pick it up in that size population. We know that there's this narrow therapeutic window, and this is a figure that's been widely touted. If you go below an international normalized ratio of around 2, you start getting your increased risk of stroke, and if you go above 3, you start getting your increased risk of intracranial bleeding. So this is a perfect risk-benefit balance situation. So warfarin, and I put on the slide warfarin equals worry, which they both start with W, so I can remember that. But I actually think this is the key to understanding the limitations of warfarin. So it has a risk of bleeding that makes people worry. All anticoagulants, all antithrombotic drugs have a risk of bleeding, but it also has a narrow therapeutic window. If your INR goes too low, you have a risk of stroke. Goes too high, you have a risk of bleeding. And then what your INR is, what your warfarin response is driven by diet, concomitant medications, other disease states, supplements, concomitant medications. There are over 100 medications which are listed on Coumadin's package insert as interacting with warfarin. So all of that means that it requires regular monitoring, monthly at best, and dose adjustment based on INR. And all of that, this regular monitoring makes patients and doctors have to think about it. So you can't forget you have atrial fibrillation if you're on warfarin. You can't forget you have a risk of bleeding. It's constantly in your face. And that's why people, I think, hate warfarin so much.
Do we have data, John, from registries or administrative databases? I mean, is undertreatment a problem in AFib?
Great question. So there have been a number of series of these, and from a variety of databases. And among patients who have an indication for warfarin, that is atrial fibrillation with a CHAD score of at least 1, about half of them are on warfarin. And it's for a whole range of reasons. And if you start trying to document contraindications they're soft. I mean, risk of bleeding, risk of fall, but they all need to worry. I mean, they're all things that make people worry. What's worse than this, I mean, and you can see here that as you get older, into the very old, the over 85, it gets really low. I mean, those are the ones who are at the most risk. So, and even those who are being treated with warfarin still, a quarter of the time they're subtherapeutic. Their INRs are less than, at least a quarter to half the time their INRs are low. So Greg Flaker, a colleague from Missouri who's involved with one of the trials that I'm also involved with, gave a talk called The War on Warfarin. And it really is right now. I mean, we're now in an era where I do a lot of research in antithrombotic development. It's incredibly exciting. I mean, tons of new anticoagulants, antiplatelet drugs being developed. And what people are looking for is safer, but at least as effective, or more effective would be nice, and critically easier to use to get rid of that worry. So people have studied aspirin. They've studied the combination of aspirin and clopidogrel. And now there have been a number of oral anticoagulants that I'm going to talk about in some more detail that have data or have ongoing clinical trials.
Now, what's interesting is that this patient population, and I think this sometimes gets lost in the conversation, is also at risk for having other procedures.
Yes.
So do we have a sense, and my guess is we don't, how often warfarin therapy needs to get interrupted? Or, for example, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, is concomitant treatment with other antiplatelet agents. What's your perspective on that type of a logistical issue?
So lots of unknowns, lots of gaps in our data. Somewhere between 10 and 20% of patients with atrial fibrillation have concomitant coronary disease. The package insert for Coumadin, at least, currently says you should not be on aspirin also, which is a huge problem in all these patients who have strong indications for both. And we're increasingly learning about combination therapy, but it's not well understood.
And it's interesting that I want you to just talk briefly about the using dual antiplatelet therapy. It appears, at least from the trials, that this is a coagulation cascade phenomenon. And while platelets may be involved, it doesn't appear to be the primary target. Is that a fair statement?
I think it's a fair statement, but I think it's an oversimplification. And if we were sitting with some of our coag experts, they would laugh at us because we're oversimplifying things. The antiplatelet drugs are effective at preventing clots in atrial fibrillation and thromboembolic strokes, but they're less effective in the trials that have been done than warfarin has been. And there have never been head-to-head comparisons of these new drugs with warfarin. Clopidogrel, I don't have slides on it, but clopidogrel was studied versus warfarin and was less effective, the combination of aspirin and clopidogrel. But more effective than aspirin alone. So it does have some added value, but clopidogrel also increases bleeding. So it's, again, that risk-benefit trade-off. All right, so there have been 3 big trials presented, and I'm going to show you the highlights of the data from each of them. The first with novel anticoagulants in atrial fibrillation. And this is just the beginning. I mean, I would say we're a third of the way through the big trial results that are going to be coming. So the RELY trial studied the direct thrombin inhibitor dabigatran versus warfarin. It was open label. That has some relevance. There were 2 dabigatran arms. That comparison was blinded. And this was in patients with atrial fibrillation and at least 1 risk factor for stroke. So it's the current group of patients where warfarin is recommended, essentially. And they followed people, they enrolled 18,000 patients, 6,000 patients per arm, and followed them for a primary outcome of stroke or systemic embolism. One really interesting methodologic thing here is you notice death isn't in there. And death in this population is at least as frequent as this, as stroke and systemic embolism, but it appears to be less responsive to anticoagulation. So the primary endpoints of these trials are stroke and systemic embolism typically. And so the RELY investigators either are incredibly smart or they're incredibly lucky, or some combination of the two, because they got the perfect trial result. So 110 milligrams of warfarin, of dabigatran versus warfarin was non-inferior, and this whole trial was set up initially as a non-inferiority trial. No one expected dabigatran to beat warfarin. People were saying, okay, we hope it's as effective as warfarin, because remember how effective warfarin is, right? So the 110 milligram dose was equally effective to warfarin, non-inferior, and the 150 twice a day dose was more effective. That is the first remarkable thing here. We have a drug that is more effective than warfarin, and we would expect this to lead to more bleeding, right? A more effective drug should lead to more bleeding. So here's the overall bleeding data. If you look at major bleeding, and this is using the International Society of Thrombosis and Hemostasis definition, you see there's no increase in bleeding with 150 milligrams compared to warfarin. So similar bleeding. There still is bleeding, but similar amounts of bleeding. But that's not what's remarkable. What's remarkable is here. It's intracranial bleeding, or here hemorrhagic stroke, a subset of intracranial bleeding. There's a 70% reduction in intracranial bleeding. So this is the worst bleeding.
That's the one that we worry about.
This is the one we and patients worry about. The W. This is the one we worry about. And here now you have a drug that is more effective on all stroke, but it's mostly actually all stroke includes hemorrhagic stroke. It's mostly driven by a reduction in hemorrhagic stroke. So dabigatran's on the market in the U.S. It's not cheap. It's not cheap. So we've been gradually, in my practice, I've been gradually transitioning patients over to dabigatran, and the big issue is going to be cost. Warfarin is cheap to buy. It's not cheap to manage, but those are health system costs. And then the other really important result out of RELY, which is a very complicated analysis, is if you look at sites that have really good warfarin control, 70% time in therapeutic range. In those centers, dabigatran isn't so clearly better than warfarin. And so there are countries that are asking if dabigatran is really better than warfarin in patients with good INR control. For me, the reduction in intracranial hemorrhage is what is compelling.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting as you transition this into out of the clinical trial setting. Certainly there are centers that probably achieve a high percentage of patients with good control, but certainly that's not the rule.
Certainly not in the United States. Certainly not in the United States. There's a number of people who are involved in the leadership of RELY, good friends and colleagues of ours who come from what we call Coumadin country. It's basically Northern Europe. And they have national, essentially, warfarin management systems. And they have single central computer databases with people's INRs in them. You can go into any clinic, get your INR checked. And those are the countries that in the trials and in registries get 70% time in therapeutic range.
Interesting.
So dabigatran was a direct thrombin inhibitor, right? So it inhibits factor 2. There are a host of factor 10 inhibitors. So that's upstream in the coagulation cascade. There are a host of factor 10 inhibitors being developed. This is rivaroxaban, which was studied in the ROCKET AF trial. Some of our colleagues here at Duke had leadership roles in this. And they studied 20 milligrams a day of rivaroxaban, slightly reduced dose for those with moderate renal insufficiency, versus warfarin. This trial has a couple of important differences. One, it was blinded. Logistically, that's a major difference. It probably increases the rigor of the trial a little bit, but it's a huge logistical undertaking. And then the other thing that's different about ROCKET is they targeted a higher risk population. So at least 2 of the typical CHADS risk factors, and about a quarter of the way through the trial, they said you have to have 3 or more. So they had a much higher risk population. Same primary endpoint, stroke or systemic embolism, same bleeding definitions, et cetera. And these data were presented relatively recently at the AHA meetings last year. So the first thing here is some baseline demographics. You can see the mean CHAD score, 3.5. and then more than half of the patients with a prior stroke. So this is not an all-comer atrial fibrillation trial. This is a high-risk atrial fibrillation trial, and this will become important when we get to the end of this whole story, and I'll come back to that. So these are the primary results. Rocket was also designed as a non-inferiority trial. All of these trials were designed, and most of them started before we knew the results of RELY. So RELY really changed the stage because now we have dabigatran, which is better. So just being non-inferior probably isn't good enough anymore. So the primary analysis was on treatment, and it clearly met non-inferiority. And I put a non-inferiority line on here, which wasn't on their slides they presented at the AHA, but it clearly met non-inferiority. And then they did a more conservative intention to treat analysis for superiority, and it just missed it. So it didn't meet a formal statistical superiority analysis. Likewise, with RELY, there was similar rates of major bleeding, but if you look at bleeding causing death, it's almost all of which is intracranial bleeding or intracranial bleeding. A substantial 50 or 30, 40% reduction. So not quite as dramatic as RELY, but a big reduction. So here again, it looks like a factor 10 inhibitor has lower rates of intracranial hemorrhage than warfarin. So maybe warfarin really is bad, and maybe particularly bad with regard to intracranial bleeding. And maybe not all bleeding is the same. I think. And then the third trial I want to touch on briefly is Avaros, which was with another factor 10 inhibitor, apixaban, 5 milligrams twice a day. Apixaban is about equal potent to rivaroxaban. So this is a lower dose than what they studied in Rocket. And this was a trial in patients who are not candidates for vitamin K antagonists. So and this is a really hard to define population.
Right.
It's not low risk. It's actually a moderate risk to moderate to high risk population who, for some reason or another, they're in those half of patients who can't take warfarin. And they randomized them to apixaban, 5 milligrams twice a day, or aspirin. So what we think of as cardiologists as the safest drug in the world, everybody should take.
Sure.
Right? So 5,600 patients, primary endpoint stroke or systemic embolism. And this trial was stopped early by a recommendation from the Data Safety Monitoring Board because of efficacy. Apixaban was better than aspirin. So here's the curves that Stuart Conley from McMaster presented at the European Society of Cardiology meetings last year. A 55% reduction in stroke or systemic embolism compared to aspirin. Now remember, aspirin has some efficacy here.
Right.
So this suggests that apixaban, not surprisingly, is an effective anticoagulant and better than aspirin. This didn't surprise anybody, I think. What did surprise people is this. So the major bleeding, no increase in major bleeding with apixaban compared to aspirin. And I think this is not because apixaban doesn't cause bleeding. I think this is because we've gotten so tall. We use aspirin in everybody, and we just ignore the fact that it causes bleeding. It causes bleeding as well. If you look at major bleeding or clinically relevant non-major bleeding or minor bleeding or fatal bleeding or intracranial bleeding, it's all about the same with apixaban and aspirin. So this suggests that apixaban's pretty safe, or that aspirin's not really as safe as we think it is. And I think it's probably more the latter. But the whole world, pretty much, at least our whole world, takes aspirin. So just two other trials that are ongoing that I want to touch on. Aristotle is the apixaban trial compared with warfarin. So it is a trial in 18,000 patients with atrial fibrillation. It's actually 120-some patients larger than RELY. So it will, at least for a short time, be the largest atrial fibrillation trial conducted. These are huge trials. And it enrolled patients with atrial fibrillation and at least one risk factor. So again, a broad atrial fibrillation population, randomized them to apixaban 5 milligrams twice a day or warfarin in a double-blind, double-dummy strategy. And the primary endpoint is stroke or systemic embolism. And these data are likely to be presented at the European Society of Cardiology meetings in August this year. So that will be another whole set of data. Will be very interesting to see how this measures up with rivaroxaban. Again, I think the key issue is dose, and with dabigatran. And then finally with edoxaban, the ENGAGE program being led by the TIMI group, another large atrial fibrillation trial. It was initially planned to be about 16,000 patients, but it has been increased in size. I don't know the details. It's studying 2 doses of edoxaban once a day compared to warfarin. Other than that, the design is basically identical. So I think all of these trials have a very similar design now, and the key thing in them is going to be dose and risk benefit trade-off. And so these are my sort of summary take-home points. Warfarin's a great drug. It's way underused for how good it is. I mean, we could spend a lot of energy. We could have spent a lot of energy thinking about how to use warfarin better to improve the outcomes of our patients. But I think everybody's relieved that, at least for atrial fibrillation, warfarin's probably going to be going away. There are holdouts who say, oh, it's cheap, and my patients are doing well on it, and so we should. It
seems to me that it's the primary example of efficacy versus effectiveness. Implementing it in clinical practice is quite a bit more complicated than simply relying on what the efficacy data are.
I think that's a great point, and I think the clinical trials enrolled and continue to enroll quite a select group of patients, and the complexities of warfarin are such that it really has a very different pattern of benefit in a general population. So safer and equally or more effective alternatives to warfarin are finally available. So my clinic patient, he's still in my clinic patient, and he's now on dabigatran. So we have dabigatran, which is better than warfarin, and rivaroxaban, which I would argue is also better than warfarin. It's not superior to warfarin from a strict trialist statistical standpoint, but I don't think anybody would argue that it's not better than warfarin. I mean, it's got lower rates of intracranial bleeding, the same or lower rates of stroke overall, similar rates of major bleeding, no need for monitoring. I mean, I don't think anybody would argue that it's not better than warfarin. My guess, I'm not that good at guessing trial results, but this is a case where I would, with these factor X inhibitors, I would be relatively confident that apixaban, edoxaban, and other factor X inhibitors are also all likely better than warfarin. And I think the big caveat there is dose. I mean, if you don't have the dose right, and you don't know that before you find out the results of your trial, then you may not be. But otherwise, these drugs are very similar in their pharmacologic activity. So I think we'll see less intracranial hemorrhage. We'll see efficacy that's at least as good as warfarin, and that they will all be easier to use. And all of that will translate into less worry for everybody.
It's amazing how quickly this field has evolved in such a short time. The obvious question I think that a lot of people are going to have is, once all these agents become available, how does one choose?
Yeah.
Is this a situation where I think the trials are sufficiently different in terms of their inclusion-exclusion criteria that you start looking at those data, or do you think those decisions are going to be made for us? Do you think the health system is going to pick one and say, this is what you're going to use?
Yeah, so I think that I made my comments that I did about the ROCKET results because as soon as ROCKET came out and people were talking about superiority, they weren't talking about whether rivaroxaban was better than warfarin. Right. What they were talking about is rivaroxaban as good as dabigatran?
And the frame of reference has shifted.
Absolutely. And, you think it's complicated now. We're going to have apixaban, we're going to have edoxaban there. And I actually don't think the trials are that different. ROCKET is different. ENGAGE with edoxaban is a little higher risk than Aristotle and RELY, but somewhere in between those and ROCKET. But otherwise, they're all quite similar. And so I do think that the right answer here, until we have a lot more research, I think the right answer here is to pick one that you and your health system are good at using and use it. And it's not only the people who you're transitioning off of warfarin, it's all of those 50% of patients who are currently not getting anything. And it's not, the title of this conference, it's not safer, but they're going to finally get the efficacy, which they've not been able to get because of the worries around warfarin.
From a regulatory standpoint, now that we have the RELY data available for future agents, do you think that there's a little bit of a difference in terms of what the comparators should be?
Yeah, great question. Our current regulations say that the FDA should approve drugs that are safe and effective, not more safe and effective. If I was in charge of writing laws, I would change that, but I'm not. I think that's a good thing overall. But so I think it's valid to use warfarin as a comparator still. But I think the bar for approval has gone up. So I think the amount of certainty that the FDA is going to want that you are as good as warfarin has appropriately gone up. And, RELY was open label. They didn't approve the 110. The FDA didn't approve the 110 dose. And that's because it was only non-inferior. And it was open label. And they've gotten a lot of criticism for that. And I think the 110 dose has a role. I mean, I think there really are patients out there who are willing to tolerate less efficacy to worry less about bleeding. And so I think the 110 dose does have a role. I expect we're going to have additional trials, not head-to-head comparisons for a long time, but additional trials that are going to provide more information about specific populations, how to use drugs in combination with antiplatelet therapies, things like that. The patients with advanced renal disease who aren't in any of these trials. Dabigatran is more renally cleared than rivaroxaban, which is a little bit more renally cleared than apixaban, and about the same as edoxaban. So, and there's some other factor X inhibitors earlier in development that have even less renal clearance. So but those are going to need more clinical trial results.
What do we know about drug-drug interactions? I mean, obviously you mentioned that's a big issue with warfarin. We all know that. The other issue, though, also is that dabigatran is twice a day. The others are once a day. I mean, these are the kinds of sort of subtle differences I would think would start playing a role in decision making.
So the drug-drug interactions, there are some drugs that amiodarone, dronedarone, that increase serum concentrations of some of these drugs in a meaningful way. I mean, twofold kind of changes in serum concentrations. People are still sort of teasing out what one should do with that with rivaroxaban, which isn't approved or labeled yet. It's not so much of an issue with dabigatran. Dabigatran is twice a day. Twice a day hasn't been a huge barrier to compliance. So I think that's all right. Apixaban is also twice a day. Rivaroxaban, which actually has a half-life that's shorter than apixaban's, was studied once a day. So would it be better at 10 milligrams twice a day? I don't know. That's another 14,000 patient trial to do. So I think that we'll continue to understand some of these things. The one big thing which we both commented on earlier is which is not a pharmacokinetic interaction, but a clinical interaction, is with antiplatelet therapy. And that's a big area that I don't think we've studied enough. And I expect that's one of the first areas where these drugs will get more investigation done.
Yeah, because that's certainly an increasing number of, or type of patient that we're seeing in the lab. And
that's right.
Certainly it's affecting our decision making with respect to the duration of antiplatelet therapy that we're using. From a practical standpoint, what are some of the caveats around dabigatran use and subsequent procedures? Is this a situation where you just tell the patient to skip your evening dose or skip your morning dose?
Yeah, the half-life, I mean, it depends on the procedure, but the half-life of all of these is short enough that all of the ones I talked about is short enough that you could skip your evening dose and do coronary intervention. If you're going to have major surgery, you probably want to skip a couple doses. And that's a lot better than warfarin, which you have to come off of for several days.
And do we have any cost-effectiveness data yet on on dabigatran with respect to, again, not the drug acquisition cost, which is clearly going to be higher for a new drug, but with respect to downstream costs, whether it's an effect by reducing stroke hospitalizations, bleeding hospitalizations, subsequent monitoring?
I mean, these are incredibly complicated, and I haven't seen published health economic data on dabigatran. I may have missed it, but the reason they're so complicated is because the warfarin monitoring system has to be factored into it. And you have to, and then I would argue, not only do you have to factor in the downstream costs of preventing strokes, which is relatively straightforward to do, but you also have to factor in the downstream costs of preventing strokes in all the people who were not previously treated.
Right.
So assessing the costs of a change in this kind of a change in paradigm is very complicated. In Europe, in Northern Europe, where they have these warfarin clinics, those are social interaction places for patients. They also get their blood pressure checked there. I mean, so it's hard to tease out what would happen if you took those away, and whether that would be a good thing or not.
Yeah, and final comment here is, again, a practical question. When you've been transitioning your patients, I mean, what's the nomogram? Like, how do you actually transition someone from warfarin to dabigatran? Certainly, if they're not treated, it becomes easy. You're starting them on something.
That's right. So the recommendations are INR less than 2, and then just start. I generally, in patients who are not incredibly high risk for stroke or incredibly high risk for bleeding, would just say stop your warfarin for 3-4 days and start. Avoiding that additional blood draw. To get an INR that's then 2.1, and what do you do? But 3, 4, 5 days off warfarin, just start. And then the other big question that comes up is around cardioversion.
Right.
At our institution right now, if you haven't had well-documented INRs above 2, like 1.9 doesn't count, for the last period of time, we want to do a transesophageal echocardiogram. The data from Reliably's, they did a pretty decent-sized transesophageal echocardioversion sub-study, and dabigatran seems very safe around cardioversion, no increased risk of stroke. So I think it'll be a boon there as well. That's just easier to keep people on.
Okay, so final question. What should be the impact of Avaros on clinical practice? Should we start using apixaban? I mean, there are some availability issues, obviously, but assuming all things being equal.
If there were no alternatives, if dabigatran didn't exist and rivaroxaban isn't clinically available, then I would say one should start using apixaban in people who you really can't start warfarin in. But I think I think it used to be a real issue that we were really undertreating people with warfarin. We should have been treating many more. And I think we actually, as a healthcare system, would have benefited our population more by being more aggressive with warfarin. Ultimately, Avaros is nice supportive data. It shows that apixaban is effective. I think the safety is instructive. I think the safety data there is instructive about how we think about aspirin and how we think about it. But I think until Aristotle comes out that has supportive results, no one's going to use apixaban.
Well, that's great. It sounds like there's a lot to look forward to in this space, at least over even the short-term future.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we'll be looking forward to hearing the Aristotle results from you. So thanks again for joining me. My guest faculty today has been John Alexander, my colleague here at Duke. John, thanks for a terrific presentation and a great discussion on an important topic. Until next time, then, from all of us here at Duke, this is Sunil Rao saying thanks for joining us and take care.